thank you. And it's a pleasure to be back again in Slovenia. I'm starting to think of it as my second home. So I'm here to try and explain a little bit more about what Bitcoin SV is. And I guess we'll go a little bit into some of the technical details, but not too deep. And of course, why Bitcoin SV is important for enterprises. So broadly, I'm going to cover, I guess, three main areas here. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of Bitcoin, and I guess a bit about what it is. And then how that relates to Bitcoin SV, the four pillars of Bitcoin SV, which we defined for ourselves, as well as to explain to other people what Bitcoin SV was all about back in 2018. And finally, if we have time, this presentation can get a bit long sometimes. I'd like to address some of the really common Bitcoin myths that are around, because for the last 11 years, there are many things, many ideas, I suppose, around Bitcoin and blockchain in general that are now simply just accepted as truth because they've been repeated so many times. And a lot of those things are fallacies, in fact. We'll get into a couple of those and I guess provide the counter argument and the explanation, because I think some of these myths have actually done a lot of damage to the public perception of Bitcoin, as well as doing a lot of damage to the way that people working on Bitcoin perceive it. So I'd like to take you right back to the beginning. In the 17th century, there was a Japanese philosopher by the name of Tominaga Nakamoto. Philosophy was one of his interests, economics and many other fields. And I like to refer to this as the precursor to the Bitcoin white paper. This is essentially the problem statement. 300 years later, Satoshi Nakamoto came along and provided the solution. So the quote says, "True history is altered by those who read it to benefit their own aims, to self-affirm their own conceptions." Now, Tominaga was primarily concerned with this concept through, as it was expressed through Buddhist scripture. He wrote a lot about the concerns that he had about how various bodies of Buddhist canonical writings, etc., had been put together out of order, and some had been changed, etc. And he was really concerned around truth in history, because, of course, Buddhism is a religion that many people practice. I don't know the precise number, but it had to be up there near 1 billion, perhaps, maybe more, maybe slightly less. But people are modeling their lives on the concepts described therein. And if you can't actually rely on those concepts being an accurate portrayal of what was originally intended, well, that has far-reaching consequences. It's not for me to say whether those consequences are good or bad, but Tominaga Nakamoto certainly felt that this was important. And I think that he also understood that the applications of truth in history were significant well beyond that particular topic. And so I'm going to get to what I think is one of the fundamental functions of Bitcoin, which is notarization. This is a concept that is pretty well understood, I think, in business. Notarization is the act of finding a third party to attest to the truth of a record of an event. That might not be necessary or useful to you right at the time when the event happens. But if some dispute should arise later on, or if you need to prove that an event happened in a certain way, then that attestation by some kind of notarization service becomes really important. So for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, we've been using notarization. We've been using it in the offline sense, which is there are individuals who are known and respected in our communities. Today we call them public notaries. Who will stake their own reputations on signing and attesting to the truth of an event. If you've ever registered a company or formed a trust or signed contracts across borders, etc., you've probably used a notary service. And of course, the principle of notarization has now moved online. We have things like SSL certificates the things that drive the secure transmission of HTTPS data on the internet. And they provide a very similar kind of service. They will attest to your identity with varying degrees of rigor, depending on how much you pay them. If you want, if you're Google, for example, you will probably shell out tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to someone like VeriSign for a rock-solid attestation that this certificate actually does belong to Google. But Bitcoin goes one step further, and it provides an effective anti-tamper solution because the witnesses that attest to the truth of an event or the fact that an event happened are not just single people. They are the group of Bitcoin miners that are spread around the world. They have one common interest, which is driving the Bitcoin blockchain forward and enabling it to kind of fulfill the value proposition that it offers. But otherwise, they're not aligned. So there is no reason, if they see one miner attesting falsely to an event, they're actually strongly incentivized to tell the world about it. And in fact, to do something in Bitcoin that we call orphaning, which is overwrite their false record. And so there's quite a few of these solutions around that have spawned since Bitcoin arrived in the world, I guess, and showed people how to do it. And they have two really key properties. The publicity of Bitcoin is something that essentially makes these event attestations, these notarizations, immutable because the whole world can see it. If somebody wants to go back and change it, well, the whole world knows that they've changed it, and of course that will raise alarm bells. And the other one, of course, is scale. This has already been spoken about, but what use is this service if only 3 people in the world can use it per second? And so these are some of the, I guess, some of the more well-known competitors to Bitcoin in this space. And you can see there is only one that actually has the two properties. R3 Corda achieves its higher levels of scalability simply by being private and by removing some critical elements of the Bitcoin design out of it. But the only one that has actually proven that it can scale and can scale in a public sense according to the original Bitcoin design is Bitcoin SV. You'll note that I don't even have BTC, Bitcoin BTC on this list. And so here's a few of the things that notarization can offer. And I've used a different description for the word in place of notarization, immutable event recording. So the attestation guarantees that I've already spoken about, those can be powerful tools for business, especially in a legal sense. Compliance efficiencies. If you run a serious business that falls under the banner of any kind of regulation, you've probably got a compliance department. Especially if you're in the fintech sector, there's a good chance that 30–40% of the people that are working in your organization are working on compliance. It's a massive industry. It's one that's often sort of behind closed doors, and the general population may not even be aware that it's there, but it's big. And of course, triple entry audit. I won't get into the details of triple entry accounting right now, except to say that the third entry is the public record. Transferable control of data. This is a hugely powerful tool. MetaNet is an embodiment of that. And of course, contract automation. The amount of money that can be saved on compliance enforcement, et cetera, for enterprises is potentially staggering. So here's a little comparison, I guess, on a few more points. We're talking about the permissioning status, the consensus model, the proof of work consensus model, without going into excruciating technical detail, is the only one that can actually work. Our nChain research team has done a lot of work on this, and one of our researchers, in fact, John Fletcher, has even constructed a mathematical proof for why proof of stake will inevitably cannibalize itself. But of course, the big one here is, if I can find the button, the throughput. And these numbers here are simply where we've gotten to today after 1 year of work. We should be a lot further on because we've actually had 11 years to work on this, but we weren't able to actually begin that work until very recently. And so I just want to explain a little bit of the history of Bitcoin SV and how it relates to the original Bitcoin, which it actually is. Just to put it all into context, because it can get confusing. People talk about Bitcoin and many people are referring to BTC when they say the word Bitcoin. There's also Bitcoin Cash, which I understand there's quite some activity here in Slovenia and the Bitcoin Cash world. And then, of course, there's Bitcoin SV. So back in the beginning, 2009, in a cowshed in Australia, Bitcoin was born. It was born with the creation of the Genesis block. I won't say it was mined, because Craig will yell at me if I do. The Bitcoin Genesis block was created, and Bitcoin traveled along for quite some time. There was much disagreement in the Bitcoin camp about the scaling roadmap. There was a group of people that decided that Satoshi Nakamoto was wrong. And as has already been mentioned, the control of the code base and hence the network was largely hijacked. In 2017, a group of developers decided that enough was enough. They were going to use the Bitcoin mechanism for resolving these kinds of disputes, and they hard forked. They created a hard fork that increased the block size, removed a few of the more offensive features that the BTC developers had brought in. And then, of course, in 2018, there was, well, it was earlier in 2018, there was more disagreement. There was a group of people who wanted to stabilize the protocol and bring Bitcoin back to its roots because we genuinely believed that the design actually could work and could scale. And there was a group of people who wanted to continue tinkering with the protocol. And so the Bitcoin SV node project was born, and our prime directive was to preserve Bitcoin because once you start adding new features into it, the history is essentially contaminated forever. And it's very, very hard to remove it. And so the chains diverged yet again, and November 2018, 15 months ago, Bitcoin SV as a separate embodiment of Bitcoin kind of came into being. And what we found was an astonishing number of businesses that had previously been building on Bitcoin Cash moved over to us. And the defining feature of those businesses was that they were actually the serious businesses, the ones that had a real business model behind them, a credible business model. A lot of the toy projects stayed on Bitcoin Cash, and many of them are still there today. Another defining feature was that everybody who wanted to play with crypto anarchy and argue that code is law and turn Bitcoin into an anonymous tool to enable, well, all of the things that you might want to do anonymously that you don't want anyone else to know about. They stayed with Bitcoin Cash. Everybody who actually wanted Bitcoin to step out into the light and be part of the real world, and that includes dealing with embracing governments, dealing with regulation, etc., switched over to the Bitcoin SV side. And so in the lead up to this dispute, commonly referred to as the hash war, we really had to define ourselves and define what it was that we stood for. Explain to ourselves first, before we could explain to the rest of the world what was the whole point of this. And we came up with this concept of the 4 pillars of BSV. These are the 4 driving principles. Firstly, on-chain scaling. We wanted to do that because we knew that it was possible and because it was exactly what Satoshi Nakamoto explained was the future of Bitcoin. The big one, I think, from our point of view, from my point of view, was stability. which was restore the protocol to the way that it was originally designed and then lock it down. And I'll show you in a moment why that is so critically important. I'll also show you why that's actually the defining feature of Bitcoin SV, which makes it different to every other blockchain. Security refers to the security and stability of the code. This has to be paramount. Bitcoin is intended to become a platform for the global economy, the global financial system. A platform like that cannot afford to have downtime. You can't sit and talk to a central bank and tell them to run your currency on top of Bitcoin when you've got a history of the network crashing. And the last one, of course, I've abbreviated, is safe instant transactions. The notion that you should be sitting and waiting 10 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever, for a transaction to go through, that's just not going to fly. Bitcoin needs to be better than all other payment methods if it's going to compete. We don't want people to use Bitcoin because they think that that Bitcoin is great. We want people to use Bitcoin because it's a better option for them. If you try to sell Bitcoin to the world because people should just love it, well, you're not going to win. There's maybe 0.1% of people in the world that actually know about Bitcoin in any depth and that care about it. We need to market to the other 99.9%. So let's talk a little bit about scaling, because scaling is really the key to securing the network and enabling all of the use cases that have been discussed and will be discussed later. So Bitcoin, firstly, is designed to scale. I'll show you why. Bitcoin has to continue scaling. Its very survival depends on it. And Bitcoin can scale today. So why was Bitcoin designed to scale? How do we know this? Well, firstly, because the inventor said it. Bitcoin can already scale much larger than Visa with existing hardware for a fraction of the cost. There are numerous other things on record from Satoshi Nakamoto where he describes not only how you can scale Bitcoin, but he describes the lifting of the block cap and actually even gives the code. There's plenty of evidence in the design of Bitcoin as well. There is one opcode in Bitcoin script, the low-level language, that actually determines whether a transfer is valid or not, that enables the embedding of a piece of data up to 4 gigabytes. That's just in a single operation. You can do this multiple times in a single transaction. And of course, you can chain lots of transactions together to get even larger data chunks. But why would this operation even exist in Bitcoin if it weren't intended to be used? So just think about that for a moment. A single transaction with 4 gigabytes of data. And we've had people telling us for the last 10 years that Bitcoin blocks should not be bigger than 1 megabyte. Of course, we've smashed that limit in Bitcoin SV. It's gone now, and this particular opcode is now usable. So why Bitcoin needs to scale? Let's talk a little bit about mining. Well, actually, no. Let's talk a little bit about finance. The Bitcoin revenue model, or rather the miner's revenue model. When Bitcoin began, every miner who mined a block every 10 minutes was granted the right to create a Coinbase transaction and issue to themselves 50 new Bitcoins. Well, they're not new Bitcoins, but the Bitcoins that hadn't been in use before. Every 4 years, this block reward is cut in half, and currently it's 12.5 Bitcoins are issued with every block. And that will continue to happen. In fact, just in a couple of months' time, it's going to halve again down to 6.25. And so there's actually a fixed amount of Bitcoin that will be distributed in this way. And in fact, the whole point of this, it's often referred to as a block subsidy, but the whole point of this was to distribute Bitcoins as far and wide as possible. And of course, it favored the people who were involved early on, helping to bootstrap the network. But that's not the long-term model for rewarding miners, the long-term model for rewarding miners is through transaction fees. And these are these tiny, tiny fees that Jimmy spoke about before. So when the Bitcoin block reward starts to shrink, as it will over time, you've got this huge gap. The only way that you can fill that gap is through increasing transaction volume. Unless you want to start charging more and more and more for a Bitcoin transaction, which is precisely what is happening on BTC, then you need to increase the volume. It's simple economics. And by my calculations, when the reward drops in April or May of this year on BTC, to account for the lost revenue based on the number of transactions that they're able to process, a Bitcoin transaction fee will need to increase by about $20 just to replace that lost revenue. It probably won't, but we will see. And so there we have the block reward shrinking to become a tiny fraction. Another reason why Bitcoin needs to scale is it's an old issue, I think, that's well known in Bitcoin circles, known as the Fidelity problem. So Fidelity is one of the largest investment funds on the planet. And they became interested in Bitcoin quite early on in its life, and they even started building beta products. And then they came out with a statement that if they flipped on the switch for their beta program, they would instantly consume all of the capacity of Bitcoin, and they still wouldn't have enough. And so, of course, they stopped investing. They couldn't do what they needed to do on Bitcoin. They started looking for other solutions. We don't seem to have that problem in Bitcoin SV. We have a raft of companies who've been sitting and investigating Bitcoin and other blockchains for several years, waiting for someone to come along, or for one to come along that could scale. And within weeks of the hash war, we had people contacting us saying exactly that. The only part that surprised them about the fact that there was a blockchain that could scale was the fact that it was the original one. A real use case for this, EHR data is creating an electronic health record for millions of patients. This is something they simply could not do without the capacity of a blockchain that can scale. And this is just, I guess, to give you a sense of the differences in scale with the amount of data that EHR is talking about using to put it on the blockchain at the current rates of data processing on various blockchains. This is basically how long it would take for Bitcoin BTC, 44 days to put all of that data on. And I won't even go into what the transaction fees would end up costing for that. Ethereum would take 59 hours, so what, nearly 3 days, 2.5 days. Bitcoin SV today, in its current form, with the scaling work that we've done so far, would take 30 minutes. And of course, the Bitcoin Tera Node that we are working on would do it immediately. Another reason that Bitcoin needs to scale is because it's the scale that actually provides the incentive for the Bitcoin network to configure itself in the optimal form. So the title here is a little bit misleading. This is not a correctly functioning Bitcoin network. This is a very, very small representation of what we call a mesh network. And this is what happens when you ask every user, as well as every miner, to run what they call fully validating nodes. No one's making any revenue off running these nodes other than the Bitcoin miners. And so they have no incentive to connect to lots and lots of other nodes simply because it costs more money to do so. And why would you spend more money if that's not going to actually create more revenue for you? And so you end up with something like this. For a message to get from one participant in the Bitcoin network to another, it has to jump through all of these hops. That's incredibly inefficient. And it gets more inefficient the more nodes that you have. I think BTC has something in the order of close to 100,000 nodes. Imagine 100,000 nodes all connecting to another 100,000 nodes. I can't even figure out the maths in my head, but it's an insane number of connections. When Bitcoin starts to scale, here's what happens. I've segregated these into the blue are the mining nodes, the ones that are actually making money off the Bitcoin network. And the red ones are the ones that are sort of hanging on the periphery, who are running these fully validating nodes without deriving any real benefit from it. And so the network starts to reconfigure itself. And here at the core of the network, the miners, the ones who are actually making money, are incentivized to be well connected to all of the other miners, and so they start spending more money on that hyper-connectivity. The ones who aren't stop running nodes, and they just start connecting to the miners from the edge of the network, and the whole network becomes vastly more efficient. And so our little message from before is suddenly reaching its destination much more quickly. In fact, it's even more efficient than that. There should be a second slide here where we actually show the message going from shop to its destination directly and bypassing the whole Bitcoin network. I won't cover this one because this is, I guess, a few of the technical objections that people often raise to scaling Bitcoin and things that often happen. But just one that I will mention is the concept of orphan blocks. We often receive some criticism for the fact that we have a higher than average number of orphan blocks on the Bitcoin network. We actually don't care about that. Bitcoin is supposed to have orphan blocks. It's part of the design. It's what incentivizes miners to start getting hyper-connected to each other the way that we demonstrated in the last slide. And so Tera Node is how we're going to do it. I'm not going to talk about the details of Tera Node. Dan will cover that after me. But I do want to talk about the goals of Tera Node. So 1 terabyte blocks. We want every transaction to be processed by every miner in the world in less than 3 seconds. In fact, I think we've dropped that target now down to 1 second. We want to be able to process billions of transactions per block. And my numbers are slightly different to Jimmy's here because I assume a 400 byte transaction size, whereas I think he used a slightly smaller one, which is still valid. It's just you always have to kind of make a guess when you do these. And of course that means that 1.68 gigabytes of data needs to be transmitted in every second. Now this is not hard. The Googles and the Facebooks of the world are doing multiples of this already, and they don't have the revenue of a global financial system behind them. So there is absolutely nothing challenging here in terms of when I look at this and consider whether we can deliver this. This is a problem that has already been solved. These kinds of scaling problems have been solved by industry for 20 years. And so lastly on scale, Bitcoin can scale. You've already seen a version of this chart. This is what's happened in the last 12 months on Bitcoin's production network. This isn't so much a demonstration of the fact that it can handle the capacity. This capacity is tiny compared to what we can handle. This is more a demonstration of the fact that that volume is actually growing. This is a better demonstration because this is our test net. And it shows numbers of transactions and blocks that have been tested out. And these numbers are always growing. There's a public website that shows the records that have been achieved on the scaling testnet as well as current activity, which anyone can go and see. So the record is there. A year ago, Bitcoin SV, when we went out in public to talk about it, we didn't have a lot in terms of track record because track record takes time to build. Here a year on, we've got it. We've achieved things that no other blockchain in the world has achieved. So let's move on to stability because this one really is key. This is the notion that Bitcoin protocol should be locked, should be set in stone. And you've already heard a bit about this today, so I won't repeat too much of it. But here's part of the reason why it's important. Global industries are built on top of stable platforms. So I've picked the example here of HTTP. The HTTP protocol could easily be TCP, for example. HTTP is an imperfect protocol. People have been whinging about it for years. But it works, and all of its imperfections can be dealt with and worked around. But because of the fact that it has been stable, a global industry has been built on top of it. The World Wide Web, Facebook, Google, you name it. All of these things are made possible by the existence of this simple, stable protocol. And if it was changing under us all the time, it would start to become unusable because browsers would stop knowing how to interpret data. Web servers would not know what to serve up. And of course, one of my favorite quotes, I'm not sure why that. Anyway, yeah, businesses need stability. If you're planning on investing millions of dollars or tens of $millions in a project that might have a lifespan of 5 years, you need to know that the platform that you're building on top of is going to be there at the end of the project and that it's not going to have changed from underneath you. Harmony, of course, is the last one. And this is really kind of easy to demonstrate. This is a little bit of history between the time when Bitcoin Cash was formed and the time that Bitcoin SV came into being. And each one of these loops represents the entire community, the entire ecosystem going around in circles. All of them are arguments that were had about changes to the Bitcoin protocol design. Each and every one of them, I can tell you, behind closed doors, the words hash war were used. There was, talk of chain splits, etc. And we already know from past experience that splitting Bitcoin chains is economically devastating to a lot of people involved. And I'd make the point that almost every one of these technical features that people were arguing about is actually possible without changing the Bitcoin protocol. No one believed us at the time. The only requirement was that you remove the limits on Bitcoin. There's two examples there. Op group and op DSV were new opcodes that were introduced or that people wanted to introduce. Since the Genesis upgrade happened 2 weeks ago, someone has actually written the script and put it on the blockchain that demonstrates that these precise functions can already be done. And in fact, Bitcoin Cash is today embroiled in yet another discussion or debate that is very likely to lead to another split in the Bitcoin Cash chain. But what has happened with Bitcoin SV? Well, we made it very clear when we began that our prime directive was to restore the protocol and then lock it down forever. And so nobody came into the Bitcoin SV sphere with the expectation that they would be able to tinker with the protocol or change it. There's simply no argument about it. And the result has been absolutely zero. Zero distraction, zero debate, zero discussion on what new features we should be putting into the protocol. And that means that everybody in the ecosystem has actually been focused on building businesses, building new technologies layered on top of Bitcoin. And I think the results actually just speak for themselves because the progress has been astonishing. And right here at the very end, it's not marked on this chart, is the Genesis upgrade. This is a restoration of the protocol. And I'd just like to make a point here because this really shows the relevance of Slovenia to Bitcoin's history. I mentioned before that in 2009, Bitcoin was built in a cowshed in Australia, or rather started in a cowshed in Australia. History will look back on this period, I think. If Bitcoin becomes the global phenomena and the world-changing phenomena that I believe it will be, these parts of Bitcoin's history, I think, will become a very important part of global history. And of course, that event in 2009, the creation of the Genesis block, was probably the most significant piece of Bitcoin history. It was the birth of Bitcoin. But the Genesis upgrade, just a few weeks ago, was probably the second most significant event in the history of Bitcoin. And that one didn't happen in a cowshed in Australia. Part of our team is based in London, but as you might have already heard, a very significant part of our Bitcoin SV team is right here in Slovenia. So I will make the point that the restoration of Bitcoin actually happened here in Slovenia. And I think that one day, this country will look back on that event and be proud. Now for the boring bit, security. We all love QA. So here's a picture of some of our members of the Bitcoin SV team. I promised I would not make them come up on stage like I did at CoinGeek, but if you're part of the SV team, would you mind just standing up just so that people can get a sense of the scale of this operation? London and Slovenian, please. Yeah. All right, you can sit down. I won't drag you up, I promised. And a really key part of that is actually not just the writing of code, but the testing of code. So we are missing a couple here, actually, but this is a segment of the QA team. Their job is just checking that everything is actually working the way that it should. And it's one of the most important functions of the Bitcoin SV team because their job is to provide confidence not just to us, but to the business community that is building on top of Bitcoin. Of course, we'd like to take it further than that. We engage a company called Trail of Bits, who are a specialist security audit firm who have specialist knowledge with Bitcoin and blockchain. I don't like to talk about the origins of how people get into this business because it's, maybe after they've turned to the light side, they may not want to turn back and recognize the dark side of the history. I'm sure some people get into it just by studying and practice, though. But these guys are brilliant. If there is a hole in your system, they know how to find it. And of course, because we're friendly with them, they tell us, and we fix those holes before anyone ever knows about it. So we've done 2 full security audits of the Bitcoin SV software, something that I don't think has been done by any other blockchain in history. And of course, the last one, the last pillar, safe instant transactions. I'm not going to go into the detail of why they can work. I think I'll just leave it at by making the point that they can work. They can work because of that network configuration that we talked about before. They can work because certain things that have been changed about Bitcoin over the years have now been changed back. And it is entirely feasible. It's a whole another presentation on its own, which I won't drag you through here right now. But it is entirely feasible for a merchant to gain almost perfect assurance that a transaction is safe and irreversible within a fraction of a second. I'll just briefly touch on why we actually need instant transactions. I think it's probably obvious, but we like to say that Bitcoiners love their coffee. Whenever we talk about instant transactions, this is the analogy that gets used. So you pay for your coffee. You can't wait 10 minutes for a transaction to get confirmed, because what happens in 10 minutes? Your coffee gets cold. We use the same analogy in Australia, actually, but we use beer, and beer gets warm, and nobody likes warm beer, certainly not in Australia. I'm just going to get to one last point before I wrap up. So Bitcoin is capable of offering settlement services in a way that is probably a bit more business friendly than people might have typically understood. It's able to offer SLAs depending on how you interrogate the Bitcoin network and choose to interact with it. We now have a feature called Merchant API, which enables a thing called fee discovery, which has never been available in Bitcoin before. We can go out to the Bitcoin network and find out what sort of fees are being asked for by miners, and you can work out what fee you need to pay to gain different levels of assurance. So there's a few more categories here, but I've just boiled it down to 3. I want to transfer money to someone else. And the first scenario might be trusted transfer, where I'm transferring from one wallet that I own to another wallet that I own, or perhaps to my wife's wallet. In that case, I know there's no risk of anyone trying to defraud me, so I can actually pay a much lower fee as a result of that, because I don't need the assurance or certain assurances that the Bitcoin network can provide. I don't need miners to protect me from a double spend. Time mitigated risk means I actually do want the miners to protect me from a double spend, but I don't care if it takes 10 minutes or 24 hours or even a week for my transaction to get mined and settled. And of course, there's the no risk option, which is the highest possible fee that you need to pay, which is still incredibly low, still, you know, fractions of a cent, which of course offers almost no risk whatsoever. Last thing, I'll just quickly touch on Bitcoin myths. I'm actually just going to list them for you because of the time overrun. And what I will do is I'll invite anybody who actually wants the technical explanation for any of these to speak to me during one of the breaks. I'll be more than happy to. And so I will simply make the assertion that these are myths. Blockchains don't scale. Well, that's rubbish. You've already seen the results. We spent the last year proving that that's not true. Scaling leads to centralization. There's a really interesting discussion to be had around here around the analogy between Bitcoin miners and political parties and the way that political party systems work. The short answer is no, it doesn't. Users need to validate transactions, their own transactions. The really short version of this is, what are they going to do about it if they find the miners are cheating? They actually can't, there are no actions that they could take. The other part of the answer to that question is that miners are highly incentivized not to cheat. Wasteful energy consumption. There are huge amounts of, a huge number of ways that Bitcoin is actually contributing to the economical uses of energy and to the production of more renewable energy. And the last one, block propagation, I'm just going to leave alone because, frankly, it's silly and it's quite a long explanation. So that's all for me. I will be back a little later today to stand in for the nChain CEO, so I will keep that one a lot shorter. But I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I would particularly like to thank Slovenia for their contribution to the history of Bitcoin SV.